Hello there, this is Walter Cass with Independence News. Today I'm going to be reacting to this video here, so please like and subscribe, and let's go ahead and get right into the video here.
If any industry's been reduced to a cemetery plot in the popular imagination, it's journalism.
Today is National Milk Day, a day I'm sure you have been looking forward to celebrating.
Once the inspiration for cinematic heroes, journalists have increasingly become a source of skepticism, mockery, and hate. America has always prided itself on the power of its fourth estate, but increasingly kind of feels like it's being sold off for scraps.
Instead of go-go boots, the seductress green M&M will now wear sneakers.
From slumping profits to promiscuous clickbait to potent misinformation, the industry's under attack. And to many, the internet seems like the obvious culprit. But is it? Maybe it's more complicated. According to Reporters Without Borders, America only has the 45th most.
Only the 45th most. So we go here. So this is the Reporters Without Borders website here. Number 1, Norway. 2, Ireland. 3, Denmark. 4, Sweden. 5, Finland. 6, Netherlands. All of these democratic socialist countries. Huh, you don't say. Lithuania, Estonia, Portugal, Timor-Leste, Liechtenstein, Switzerland, New Zealand, Czechia, Canada, the country right north to us, Latvia, Slovakia, Iceland, Samoa, Luxembourg, Germany, Namibia, Costa Rica, Bhutan, South Africa, United Kingdom. Nah, it doesn't work very well like that. Australia, Moldova, Austria, Trinidad and Tobago, Belgium, Jamaica, Cabo Verde, Celestis, Taiwan, and Spain, Andorra, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Argentina, Italy, Croatia, Dominican Republic, and Tonga, and of course the United States is 45th because the United States sucks. But I want to make it better, that's why I'm doing this thing. I don't know why I did that like that.
Most free press in the world, and many seasoned journalists fear their industry is already dead. So how did we go from this to this? In short, who killed journalism? Trick question, because while we usually assume the internet is the grim reaper of the industry, there's no one culprit responsible for journalism's demise. So where did this existential crisis come from? Let's start with government, because while we might think of the press as independent, the history is way more complex. As scholar Robert W. McChesney and journalist John Nichols explain, the government in fact created the free press throughout American history with aggressive and often enlightened policies and subsidies. Without this massive government role, it is unlikely that US democracy would have survived, let alone blossomed. See, in the country's early days, the government supported its nascent media ecosystem through tax exemptions, government contracts, and, most notably, subsidies on postal service, which meant newspapers could be delivered at a tiny fraction of the market rate, or even free. While newspapers were generally funded by political parties or special interest groups, there was plenty of room for, and dissemination of, competing views. McChesney and Nichols argued that, as a result, the growing population of the United States stayed informed and literate, and that, in turn, helped to drive economics and the engine of democracy. Commercial interest took over American media in the late 19th century, as advertisements became the main financial support for newspapers. This commercialization was followed by the creation of the newspaper chain, in which publishers like William Randolph Hearst owned massive networks of publications. Some at the time voiced concerns that corporate and advertisers' interests might interfere with the freedom of the press, but those last gasps of worry faded after the New Deal. That's in part because complaining about free enterprise started sounding a bit commie-curious. Journalism professionalized, creating standards for objective news to justify its insistence on self-regulation. When TV news rolled around, seasoned newspaper reporters transitioned onto the screen. Importantly, in 1949, the perceived objectivity of radio and TV journalism was bolstered by what's called the Fairness Doctrine, which mandated that holders of broadcast licenses had a duty to the public interest. Thus, they needed to spend a certain amount of time covering issues of importance, and giving voice to disparate points of view. Flash forward 20 years. Aspiring President Richard Nixon meets a young TV producer named Roger Ailes and hires him to advise his winning campaign. In 1970, Ailes, obsessed with the supposed liberal bias in media, wrote a plan for putting the GOP on TV news, which he thought could be paid for and run by the White House. According to him, people are lazy. With television, you just sit, watch, listen. The thinking is done for you, unlike YouTube, where you think for yourself. Though his dream was to provide pro-administration, videotape, hard news actualities, the plan today reads like a blueprint for Fox News, which Ailes would later helm. Of course, Nixon didn't last long enough for Ailes to realize his dream, but the perfect B-movie actor-shaped vessel would appear to reshape the media in Ailes' vision. As journalist Brian J. Karam writes, the end of a free press began in earnest when Reagan stepped into the White House. Under Ailes and FCC Chair Mark Fowler, deregulation of the media went into overdrive. Fowler, who believed that television was merely a tool with pictures, wanted government out of the way, a goal best symbolized by the abolishment of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987, which freed up the network broadcasters to talk about whatever, whenever. The FCC also gutted regulation against TV news in general, loosening limitations on how many outlets anyone company could own, thus beginning an age of corporate consolidation. They also abolished other restrictions, like limitations on the number of commercials in TV news. And while we think of journalism as merely a commercial enterprise, when it comes to radio and television, and eventually the internet, we are talking about communication infrastructure that was developed by the government via heavy public investment, and then handed off to a few select companies in the name of free markets. Those companies grew insanely wealthy off our public resources. So when we talk about a duty to the public in the context of radio or broadcast television, there's actually a material basis beyond the fourth estate is clutch for democracy. As a result of Reagan's deregulation, Karam writes, the networks grew larger, and without making television owners treat their property as a trusteeship with responsibilities to protect the Commonwealth instead of preying on it, greed and avarice took over. At the same time Reagan was freeing the press from government interference, he was being very interfering with it, running what Congress eventually acknowledged was a secret propaganda campaign to rally support for his funding of the Contras war in Nicaragua. According to the Government Accountability Office, the State Department covertly set up a campaign to use prohibited covert propaganda activities designed to influence the media and the public, including tips to TV news, arranging for journalists to meet Contra leaders, and even secretly ghostwriting articles for major newspapers. So under Reagan, news was deregulated and undermined by government interference. It was more of the same under the first Bush presidency, when the Gulf War posed a PR problem for a Pentagon still recovering trust after Vietnam. They now had to figure out how to show a war without any of that inconvenient bloodshed. To that end, the military actually used camera-equipped high-tech weaponry to produce video game-style coverage that the media relied on, partly because the military also limited reporter access to the war. Karam laments that true independence in the press was dead just after the Gulf War. By 1996, President Bill Clinton signed the Telecommunications Act into law, which fairness and accuracy in reporting described as a measure essentially bought and paid for by corporate media lobbies that opened the floodgates on mergers by further removing regulations. While it was sold as eliminating barriers to entry, Karam writes that it actually gave giant corporations the ability to cannibalize the industry. In 1983, approximately 80% of the media was controlled by 20 or so corporations. By 2012, 90% was controlled by just 6. Before the Act's passage, companies could only own 40 radio stations. Today, iHeartMedia owns more than 850 of the country's 15,000 commercial radio stations. And government deregulation didn't mean lack of government interference. Under George W. Bush, the Patriot Act made the surveillance of journalists an alarmingly common practice.
Trace email messages from place to place, making it easier to surveil people.
While Obama used the Espionage Act an unprecedented 8 times to stifle the flow of information to reporters. For context, it was only used 4 times total for this. So changes in government policy reduced news from a vibrant competitive market to something of an oligopoly, while those in power used coverage for their own ends. Now let's look more closely at how big business, enabled by the government, took a machete to journalistic principles. As McChesney notes, from the late 1970s on, large corporate chains were eating up the daily newspaper industry, creating an environment rife with hyper-commercialism and denigration of journalism and public service. Further deregulation increasingly consolidated news platforms across mediums, but the effects have hit newspapers the hardest. These corporations then led their chains with what journalist Pete Hamill calls the abstract management techniques of other businesses: cereals, real estate, parking lots. This meant cutting costs with massive layoffs, and while that's been a decades-long process, it's really escalated in recent years, with employment at newspapers plummeting by 57% from 2008 to 2020. It's also worth noting what kinds of reporting gets cut. Profit-minded thinking means less investment in important but expensive positions, like foreign correspondents, investigative journalists, and science journalists. This rigorous reporting was replaced with an increase in shock-and-awe coverage and feel-good news. Meanwhile, the growing dominance of chain newspapers and consolidation of TV news meant that the same stories were being disseminated across the country, with no local or regional variety, which is why results have been most dire for local daily newspapers, where cost-cutting measures have left lone journalists to cover beats formerly manned by 25 reporters, according to Karam. This has real consequences. Research from Notre Dame and the University of Illinois found that when newsrooms institute layoffs, taxpayers actually pay more money, because there's less oversight against government corruption. But it doesn't only matter if you're a Cincinnatian reading the Cincinnati Herald. Local news has always flown upstream, with its finest coverage inspiring anywhere between 85 and 95% of professionally reported news in national newspapers and television news. As scholar Nikki Usher writes, losing local news also leaves national news to pick up the slack, meaning many people in the United States do not see where they live or people like them authentically presented in the news. And when news starts getting sucky, people start tuning out. Media expert Ed Herman says, newspapers were once thought to bring communities together. That's not the case anymore. People aren't stupid. They recognize when their local newspaper loses interest in them as anything but consumers of advertisements. And multiple studies have found that the decrease in local news is correlated with declining public knowledge and political fragmentation. Combined with the end of the Fairness Doctrine taking away all requirements for broadcast news to be public serving, this means political knowledge is filled in by advertising. By 2006, University of Wisconsin researchers found that local television news viewers got considerably more information about campaigns from paid political advertisements than from actual news coverage. Ever since CNN established itself as the first 24-hour broadcast network in 1980, changing formats have affected the perceived legitimacy of the news. According to scholars Martin Hurst and Roger Patching, the now constant 24-hour news cycle means that we get daily chunks of news, often disconnected from a time context. Whatever bleeds or drives a white Ford Bronco leads, and arguably, it distorts our sense of reality and even the continuity of time when a disappearing submersible briefly consumes the media, only to quickly be forgotten. The instantaneity afforded by TV news and internet technology means that audiences are primed to expect to know things in real time, which often isn't possible, forcing journalists to rely more on speculation and sensationalism than fact. At the same time, investigative journalism has been hobbled. The priciest and riskiest investment for any news outlet, investigative journalism is also arguably the most important when it comes to shining light on endemic wrongs. Ever since it was standardized in the early 20th century, investigative journalism has been used to blow a whistle on everything from racial discrimination in housing, to private military cartels, to asbestos companies, to Afghanistan war contracts. From 1993 to 1998, a Pew Research study of local TV stations found that the number of original watchdog reports fell from 1 per 60 news stories to 1 per 150. This trend accelerated again after a huge buyout in 2019, followed by massive layoffs. After the Austin American-Statesman was acquired by a national publishing chain in 2018, its investigative reporting went from 15 stories a month to 2. In local communities, this has real ramifications. As scholar Gregory J. Martin puts it, the worry is, who else will investigate a scandal in some small regional city? The existence of this kind of coverage is important for accountability of elected officials and has positive effects on the functioning of representative democracy. Corporate consolidation doesn't just affect the capacity of journalists to investigate corruption. It affects their editorial independence too. The consolidation of ownership, according to journalist Ben Bagdikian, gives each of the 5 corporations and their leaders more communications power than was exercised by any despot or dictatorship in history. Corporate consolidation effectively destroyed editorial independence, once journalism's prime currency. According to Karam, publishers are increasingly meddling in editorial coverage, especially any content deemed subversive. As he writes, if you work for a large corporation covering the news, does anyone think the board of directors would want or allow inquisitive reporters poking their noses into the corporate business? No, sir. To make matters worse, strapped budgets and increased need to churn out copy has increased journalistic reliance on PR from corporations and special interest groups. Back in 2003, Professor Anne Gregory estimated that 80% of business news and up to 50% of general news was generated or directly influenced by PR firms. They'd provide copy in prepared journalistic form, thus empowering spokespeople to shape the story. You're not exactly going to get hard-hitting reporting on corporate America when their well-paid foot soldiers are the ones writing the copy. Given these conditions, it's no surprise that something like the labor beat, core to news coverage from the 30s to the 60s, basically vanished by the 90s. Research by Christopher Martin found that in the 70s, coverage started focusing less on unions and more on how labor conflicts affected upscale consumers. And we can see this pretty vividly in a lot of the coverage of the current writers' strike, which explains which HBO Max shows